Hey there, everybody. Welcome, welcome. It's Friday. We're working on the chicken today, so I see a lot of familiar faces. Welcome back, everybody. We had a few kind of technical issues in the last episode on Wednesday. Hopefully, we'll avoid that today, but we'll give it our best shot. So this is what we're working on today. This chicken here. If you're looking for the reference photo, it is in the description underneath the video. So you can feel free to pull that up and to work from this. You can print it up or work on it from like a digital screen. So what I have in front of me is a projection of that reference as well as the drawing. And also I want to kind of shout out to everybody who's been participating on artistnetwork.com and the Drawing Together section. There we have a whole page that lists out each of the episodes, and if you click on those, you'll find the video as well as the ability to share your work and your experiences with other people. And we've had a tremendous outpouring there. So a lot of people sharing the work, and I really want to thank you all for doing that. It's awesome to see the work that's coming out of this series. So thank you for that. We're going to get started. This is actually when I worked on this earlier, in preparation for this, and it was a lot more work than I had kind of anticipated. So I want to get right into it. There's a lot of information on here, so we're going to simplify the background, really just focus on the form, and in particular, utilizing all the information we have in here to really capture the texture. There's a lot of variety in the feathers that we see on this chicken, so I think there was far more to it than I kind of anticipated going into it. And so that's really what our focus is going to be. I'm working with charcoal today, primarily this 4B charcoal pencil. I do have some vine charcoal that I'll be working with initially. Of course, my trusty shading stump, which is my new favorite tool. And then I have my kneaded eraser and rubber eraser as well. So we're going to dig right into it. I've got my vine charcoal. This is just a soft vine charcoal, and my what I want to do is try to get rid of the white of the paper. I think that's going to really kind of throw things off for me. And in particular, one of the things I'm looking at is that we have this nice kind of variation in value where it gets dark here on the tail and a little bit lighter over here. And I'm going to try to accentuate that by maybe lightening up the background, darkening the background over here, and play around with values in that background to help me kind of express what's happening with the values in the chicken here. So this is just a very soft vine charcoal. This is just a smooth drawing paper that I'm working with. It's not the rag paper that I was working with last time. This is an 11 by 14 paper, so it's a decent size, nothing too large. I'm just trying to darken this page a little bit. And in my mind, what I'm doing is I'm trying to think about the overall scale of the bird here. I want to make sure that the whole chicken fits on the page. So what I'm doing here is it's just kind of lightly indicating kind of the ground. One of the things that's really kind of helpful is we see these little dark marks of the cast shadow of the chicken here, and I want to make sure that I include that. One of the things that was challenging in my initial attempt at this was keeping the scale in line. And so if I can at least set the parameters of where it should fit on the page, that'll help me ensure that as I move through and finish the drawing, that it all fits properly. Just using the side and the palm of my hand to do some kind of smudging out here. Let's see, I'm kind of thinking through there, and I can start to indicate the basic lines and shapes. Again, if you're new to this series, you may not have heard me say this, but for those of you who have been with us for a while now, I say this a lot, but these initial marks are all about just getting information on the page. So then I have something very specific to react to in terms of the proportions. I can look at this and I can say this line it's too long, it's too short, it's too high, too low, etc. It's very difficult to make those decisions without additional information to work with. It's all about establishing relationships on the page. And so it's really helpful just to get marks on there rather than try to hit it right away. and try to make that mark perfect right out the gate. What we're trying to do is kind of sneak up on the form and make adjustments as we go. So I'm just starting to kind of reacting in a gestural way to the form that I'm seeing. I'm not really thinking about making it accurate, but I'm just moving my eyes very quickly back and forth between the reference photo and the page, and just going with it. I'm trying not to kind of edit it at this point. I can see things that are off right now, and I'm just going to gradually try to adjust them as I go. Right now, though, I can see as I'm starting to correct, I'm pushing this tail off to the right, and maybe that's going to work well for me, and maybe I kind of like that asymmetry. I don't necessarily have to have it pushed, placed right in the center. So maybe I'm going to let that go as long as I have enough room for that tail. And in this early stage, I'm also thinking about just establishing the early value relationships of dark against light, and then maybe dark against light here. So maybe artificially darkening the background over on this side. I like to imagine many times that I'm kind of drawing in sand. It's something that you can lay down and you can move these marks, you can wipe them out, you can reestablish them. And doing it all very quickly, none of this stuff is, kind of permanent at this stage. And you can get through a lot of drawing. I always recommend doing as much gesture drawing as you can, because in a gesture, you're addressing so many elements of drawing, but you're doing it very, very quickly. And one of the least critical elements in a whole drawing is the detail. But yet we often spend so much time doing that. So if you just focus on gestural work, again, you're addressing a lot of the main issues inherent in the drawing process, but you're not committing a huge amount of time, so you can get through a lot of drawing very quickly. And so what I'm thinking about as I'm creating this gesture, again, is just kind of reacting to the forms, not overthinking, and letting my marks try to synchronize with my observations. And again, it's a process that's very, very quick. I'm allowing my eyes to move rapidly back and forth. And knowing that this is vine charcoal and it's all going to wipe away very easily, I'm not worried about that. This is really more about getting my brain kind of accustomed to what are the main challenges that I want to deal with. And so, we're only a few minutes into the drawing now, and now I've already worked on that form, many times. And each time I'm becoming a bit more familiar with the proportions and the areas that are going to give me trouble in the end. So it's really worth it to do some quick gestural drawing at the beginning of all of this. So just checking here to see if there's any questions. If you do have a question, it can get a little bit overwhelming to kind of look through the entire chat field. And so if you do have a question that you'd like me to address real time, feel free to put that in all caps. And I'm more likely to be able to catch that. I'd hate to miss something that's kind of holding any of you up. So I could feel now like this chicken is gradually moving off to the right as I correct. And now I feel like it's getting a little bit too far over. So I can start to move. I can see the faint ghost of some of my marks. On here, and so I can move it over a little bit more. The edges of this are going to be really fun to deal with, especially creating that form to make it feel like it's wrapping around the top, on the sides of the chicken. So because he's in profile right now, it's we don't have a lot of information to really lock onto in terms of its kind of three-dimensional quality. So those edges are going to be really critical. in terms of expressing the, the three-dimensional form there. So there are a few things that I'm noticing that are going to be really helpful in terms of getting the proportions right. In this curve along here, this arch along the back, there's a transition from the neck onto the back that I'm going to use as kind of a key point, and as I drop a plumb line down, I can see where that aligns with this lower leg here, and that'll help me place those legs properly. Again, I know that these marks are going to disappear, so this is more about getting my head in the game and thinking correctly about these forms rather than these actually leading to final marks in the drawing. So as long as I can fit this, yeah, maybe I'll bring this ground line a little bit lower. So the chicken's gotten a little bit bigger since my initial attempt. All right. Jam has a good question. When you can see a paper's tooth is getting too full, does erasing worsen this? Honestly, I don't know. This paper doesn't have a whole lot of tooth, and let me try to think about that. Erasing can, because it is difficult for an eraser to really get into the tooth of the paper if you're trying to pull that back out. So if the tooth is really kind of filled in with charcoal, it can be difficult, but I think you'll probably be able to, and I think a kneaded eraser is perhaps more effective at that, about pulling charcoal up and getting that tooth back. But it can kind of fill in, and I kind of like that. It kind of goes into the seasoning of the paper, as I like to call it, or refer to it as like, I like these initial layers of vine charcoal because it allows the compressed charcoal to be a little bit more sensitive on the page. It's not quite as bold when I lay it down, if that makes sense. So Pranya is asking what brand charcoal. These are General's charcoal pencils, but I have Richeson's compressed charcoal that I really like. The Vine charcoal, actually I can't remember which brand of Vine charcoal, but really they're all quite good. And I often, honestly, I don't spend enough time really focusing on the brands to suggest one over another. And I may work with a brand that doesn't really work for me, but may work really well for you. So I just want to kind of put that out there that experiment and see what works for you. So now I have my compressed charcoal pencil here. Again, this is a 4B. You can see that I've taken a razor blade and I've carved away the wood casing to expose some of the core, and I'm utilizing the side of it. I got a lot of questions in the last drawing about how to keep the pencil sharp, and one of the ways to do that is to utilize the side of the pencil as much as possible. With it being a cylindrical form, when you're working on the side, there's always kind of a sharp edge to that. There's always one edge that is only going to make contact at a very small point. And so if you're constantly rolling your pencil, you're always going to find a new kind of nice kind of sharp point there. And then I'm trying to preserve the tip for only a few small areas of detail. So right now, I'm trying to make marks that are a little bit more permanent. I feel like this can become a little bit longer. Maybe this needs to come over a little bit more. I'm doing a little bit of angle sighting. So one of the things that can be helpful at this point is, especially if you have the printout, you can try to find the general angle. So if I'm looking at the back of the neck, for example, carrying that across, and I feel like I've generally gotten it, try to break this curve down into a sequence of shorter straight marks. So like right along here, it starts to become horizontal. Try to find that general angle right in this section here. And if you break that curve down into general kind of shorter, straighter marks, it'll all accumulate together to create a curve, and it's going to feel a bit more naturalistic. So you can see that this side has gotten really hazy. The correct edge is somewhere in there, but I haven't quite locked it down. And a lot of drawing is about working in one area, but always being aware of the entire context of the drawing. So that as I'm making the mark here, I'm also thinking about other parts other parts of the bird. And really try to move around the drawing. So here what I'm doing in the tail end is just trying to visualize this basic shape here. We have a general kind of straight edge here and another angle along here. I'm not worried about these notches and some of those kind of more specific details at this point. And I'm going to continue to make adjustments as I go. And it's really helpful to keep old marks on the page so you can see those lines move up and down. Greg is asking about the grid method to get correct proportions. I think that works out really well for if you're trying to, if your goal is to create an accurate representation and a duplication of a photo, right? That's one way to get to it very quickly. My main focus in this whole series though is to build my drawing skills that in such a way that I want to be able to go out on location and more accurately capture the proportions in front of me. And in order to do that, I need to rely on other tools like this is angle sighting, comparing the angles, comparative measuring, looking at various elements within the drawing and comparing it to others, as well as using plumb lines, horizontal lines, things like that. So I know that in the field when I'm outdoors painting, I won't be able to use the grid. So I'm using this time to just try to strengthen those other areas, if that makes sense. And so it really all comes down to what works for you and what your ultimate objective is with the drawing. Like I said, I think it works out really well to be able to control the proportions. But there's actually a similarity to actually working with the grid method. As we start to lay these lines down, they form kind of their own grid. As I set the parameters, for example, of say the back and say the lower portion of the chicken here, then that defines the space that I can then break up even farther. And I know that if these lines are correct, as I work in here, it's just a matter of breaking it down even farther. It's like seeing how this wing is just a little bit below halfway. And then as I work in this area, I can look to be more specific with that. So in a way, there's not a whole lot of difference there, but I'm using the proportions of the bird and the line of the bird to create kind of the parameters similar to what a grid would do, if that makes sense. So doing some negative drawing in here to kind of refine that out a little bit. And then one of the things that you want to be mindful of is that we interpret the proportion of shapes differently when they're a solid shape versus when we see the lines. And so that's one way to kind of double check your proportions is as you block it in as a solid form, how do you interpret that shape? Does it still hold up? Because sometimes when it's just an outline and it doesn't have the visual weight that a solid shape has, it affects our impression or understanding of those proportions. So being able to think in terms of line and shape can be really helpful. I really like what's happening down in here. I want to darken this area here so that I have a contrast between dark background and lighter feathers here. And then as we move up here, this becomes lighter against dark. So alternating that the value relationships. I'm going to start to indicate that down in here as well. Hello from Botswana. All right. That's excellent. Trying to look to see if there's any other questions. Let's see. Oh, I see. Okay, just looking at your question there, Greg. I see that you had asked it earlier, but let me know if you have any other questions about that. And then Arlene is asking about fixative. I've had a few questions about that. I don't actually spray fix my drawings, in part because I don't really, this is all about an exercise to me. It's not something that I'm ever going to display for people. And then if it is something that I want to put it under glass, that's going to ultimately protect it. Spray fixative, I think, can work really well, but you do want to be careful about how it might affect the overall tone of the drawing. It can sometimes increase the contrast, which sometimes it actually looks really awesome. Sometimes it doesn't work out so well. You can also look at, if you're keeping them, if you're storing them kind of layered on top of one another, you can use kind of sheets of Mylar to help protect them as well. And unfortunately, because I don't use enough spray fixative, I don't feel like I can confidently suggest one brand over another. But I do know that if you work with a kind of a trusted brand, there's a lot of science that goes into drawing materials, into the charcoal, into the fixative, to make things that really work for artists. And so find something that works for you, and if it's a big brand for professional artists, I think you're going to be happy with it. All right, so as you can see, this form is starting to come together. I think this is going to visually is confusing me here, so I need to smooth out this shape a little bit. Not a lot of modulation in the form at this point. I'm just trying to block in that shape, almost like a silhouette. It's really difficult in this photo to see this edge along here, and I want my drawing to actually reflect that. I think that's going to help to add to the three-dimensional nature of it. But I'm feeling pretty confident now, and we can make kind of minor adjustments to the form as we go along. As long as we're kind of in the ballpark, as I'm looking, I feel like this curve of the neck is not quite right. But rather than really kind of sit with that for now, I'm going to let that be, and if I'm feeling confident generally about the overall form, I can start to become a bit more specific, especially up here in the beak area, up in the head. And let me see, here's what I want to do. I think I like how the beak is kind of light against a darker background, so I may artificially darken this in here. And then I'm going to erase that beak so it's light against that dark background. All right, and then let me see. I'm actually doing some negative drawing right now. So what I'm doing is I'm actually looking at the shape of this background in here as I'm starting to create those wattles there. See, I'm looking for that angle of the beak. And what I'm noticing, though, is that if I drop a plumb line down, say from here, the beak here, and I look over some of these early marks here, I think I have that a bit too far over. So I'm dropping a line right down here to try to see what that distance looks like. So that beak, it just sticks out a little bit farther than this part here. And so what that suggests to me is that everything needs to kind of shift over a little bit. I'm feeling confident about the placement of this. I'm going to set that as an anchor, and now I can kind of bring this over here. So let me see, just kind of now I'm working in this area using the same general concepts that I did with the whole bird, but I'm just focusing on this one small area. Trying to think generally about the form. And I think what you're going to find is that this is going to be a drawing where it really all comes together quite a bit at the end. But all of this initial work, searching for the overall proportions, getting those correct proportions, is going to be helpful in actually creating that texture as well. Looking for the general axis of the head here. Kind of indicating where the eye might be. I gotta really see what's happening in this area. It's all very subtle. Another way, like if you're looking for just kind of a quick laying in of the line, if you're worried about the proportions, is to take graphite or charcoal all across the back here, flip it over, and then trace, and that transfers onto the page, and you actually get an accurate kind of transfer of that form. And sometimes that can be a little bit easier than the grid method. One of the things that I've struggled with when using the grid method is creating lines that feel fluid and unified, because I'm dealing with section to section, section to section, and then and if we have a line that spans multiple sections, sometimes it feels disjointed from there, and so that's again just something to kind of be aware of, and that's where I always kind of struggle with. I think that's one of the reasons why I don't naturally kind of gravitate to that method. So what I want to do here is I'm looking at the shape of the shadows now. These kind of dark areas in here. And before I lock that shape of the head in, I'm kind of indicating now the top, the crown there, this lower part of the wattle, and that gives me a distinct proportion that I can use. So I can measure that height and then measure down the height of the bird. So if I have 1 here, 2, 3, 4, 4 of those head heights gets me to the base of the bird, and I want to compare that to what I'm seeing here. So if I take that measurement here, 1, 2, 3, 4, that's okay. So I'm in pretty good shape here, because it's really easy. That head is small, and I think it's easy to make it smaller than it actually is. But I think it's kind of an important proportion that I want to just kind of double check quickly. So I feel like I'm generally in the ballpark, and it can be off a little bit, but we want to be careful about it being too noticeably off. So all right, here we go. What I'm going to do now is I'm kind of darkening in that background, kind of laid in the lines of the beak, and now I'm going to kind of erase out the beak from there and kind of work back and forth between working the beak and the that background. Actually, so I want to be careful not to overstate some of the details in that area. So I'm just going to use my shading stump, kind of smooth this out, maybe reestablish that. Using my shading stump, I'm going to add a little bit more form, but it's going to keep these marks really subtle. If I go right to this with my charcoal pencil, those marks are going to be really dark, and the marks on the head aren't nearly as dark as as some of these shadows here. So I'm just kind of sneaking up on these values a little bit. Actually, what I want to do is I've got that front wattle, then a shadow, and then I'm going to erase out a little light along that red ridge there. And using kind of a fine edge, I can selectively sharpen some of these areas here. So I want to keep these marks really kind of delicate to reflect the nature of the material. This is a soft, kind of fleshy material. So I want my marks to kind of reflect that. And again, now that I know the general height of the head, I don't have to worry about anything that's happening down in here at this point. I can trust those proportions, and that's going to hold up. Let's see. All right, I'm just kind of focusing right now in this area. giving a little bit of form to that. And I'm trying to observe the shape of the shadows more than anything. So I'm trying to think in terms of shape, not line. And I think I can erase this white part here. I don't know the anatomy of chickens well enough to say what that actually is. Maybe drop his eye right here. Not a complete circle, we'll make a little spot for the highlight. So I'm utilizing the side of the pencil here, and that helps to keep that edge sharp. All right. Christy, I'm using a 4B charcoal pencil is what I'm using. And then, yeah, somebody's calling out about the proportions of the head. It feels a little small, but I'm going to try to trust it. If I take 1, 2, 3, 4 head heights, it gets me near the bottom of the chicken. And I can compare that to this as well. So if I go like this, if I take 1, 2, excuse me here, 1, 2, 3, 4, just about the bottom. I think it is a little bit small, so I might have to bring this up a little bit. And actually it's going to work in my favor a little bit. So there's some of these lines here are going to need to adjust. Now that I've kind of anchored the shape of the head in there, that becomes a key reference that is going to affect all the proportions in the drawing. I've kind of locked that in, and I need to be aware of that as I go. So if I go 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's going to become the new bottom of the bird. And then that's going to affect how I manage the legs. So I don't want to be trusting any of these marks. These are just ballparks right now to get me in the playing field. But if as I go along, I need to be able to adjust them. So I think what I need to do now is kind of lightly suggest this edge along in here. I think the back needs to come up a little bit more too, so something more like that is feeling a little bit better. That edge is so soft with the way it wraps around there. Barb, you're asking about different charcoal weights. Yeah, so this brand of charcoal pencil is labeled very similarly to graphite, where you're going to have a graduated scale of its softness and thus its darkness. So this is a 4B, which means it's relatively soft. A 2B is kind of a medium, and so it's kind of a different naming convention that you'll want to be aware of. So this would be a 6B would be even darker. So this is kind of a mid kind of darkness for charcoal, kind of a softness. So I'm just kind of blocking in these values here. I want to darken in here, and I'm feeling a bit better about these overall proportions now. And I think what I'll do is actually kind of work across the bird. Now let's see, if I take the height here, if I carry a horizontal line across, it comes right in line with this white thing. So that means that the height of those tail feathers is pretty close to accurate. And then you got to ask yourself, as you're going along, what is what is your tolerance in terms of accuracy? You know, is this really about capturing the overall essence? Is it about matching the photo one-to-one? And it's going to vary for you. You're going to decide for yourself what that tolerance looks like and how you want to evaluate that. You know, to me, the drawing becomes its own thing, and so I need this to function on its own as a drawing, and not necessarily just evaluate it in terms of its, you know, how accurate it looks compared to the photograph. I'm not making a photograph here. I'm making a drawing, and I need to remind myself that. And so with that, there are certain kind of inherent qualities to drawing that I can express. So line work, for example, I can modulate the line, I can control the values, I can look at kind of the direction of the marks. Those are all things that the photograph can't do. And so I want to kind of exploit those natural qualities of drawing a bit more, I think, in this. All right, so I'm just kind of blocking in values, so as I squint my eyes, I can see kind of subtle transitions in terms of value. My instinct right now is to get in and start working on those feathers, and so I'm actively fighting that, and I'm trying to make sure I understand the totality of the form before I start getting bogged down in all the details here. So. And I can see it gets a little bit darker under this side here. And now within that, there's variations that I'm going to use my eraser to adjust. But you know, this is a way of drawing that really comes out of painting. I think in terms of when I'm painting, I'm thinking in terms of form very similarly. And my big concern is I want everything to feel like it's all part of this one bird. If I focus too much on detail too early before I've really understood the overall form, then there's the potential for this to just feel too disjointed. You know, if I squint at the reference photo, all of that detail disappears, and so I want my drawing to kind of reflect more of what I see when I squint than what I see when I bring it into sharp focus. So I'm just trying to think in terms of areas of light and dark, not in terms of that detail, because I'm going to actually be utilizing that shading stump quite a bit. I'm not going to do any color added to this. This is all going to be black and white. How do you get a point on a charcoal? How do we get a point on a new vine charcoal stick? That is a good question. It's very soft, but you can see that, you know, this vine charcoal has been filed down to a point, and largely it just comes out of working with it on its side, and then just kind of gradually rocking it. Because it's such a soft material, really it's just what it's doing is it's sanding itself down. And I've rotated it, and you know, I've used basically 3 different sides to it, and it's made this kind of triangular form, and that's what ultimately leads to this kind of sharp point. So I don't necessarily do that intentionally, because I like to use vine charcoal as a way to help me visualize shape and not think about line too early. If I think too much about line early on, then what I run the risk of doing is treating it more like a coloring book, where I establish a line and then just fill it in. I'm in this style of drawing, I'm really trying to think about it as a shape, and then bringing in line for its expressive qualities, or just in a few fine areas to add some detail. All right, so let me see. I think I can leave this pretty much as it is. I'm going to come back down to this a little bit later. I'm feeling more confident about the shape of the bird. So this is my shading stump. It's been well used, and now I'm going to start to just kind of smooth things out. But as I'm going along, this isn't just about smoothing things out as much as also thinking about the forms, and still thinking about light and dark areas. Maybe continuing to refine some of these shapes. You're always drawing, you're always contributing to the form, And if you think like that, then you really maximize your potential with all of your tools, rather than thinking about only applying charcoal and then this smudging stick becomes a way of smoothing it out. Utilizing that smudging stick as a way to continually refine the shape, if that makes sense. And I found that this has been, personally, the objective in this series was to utilize this time when so many of us are at home to sharpen our skills. I don't get out to paint as much as I used to, and so I'm going to use this time to sharpen my drawing skills. It's an area in my artwork that I have neglected for far too long, because as a painter, especially of landscapes, I just get seduced by the color and mixing color and getting accurate color, and I get inhibited sometimes by my limited drawing ability in some areas. And so I have already noticed a big kind of improvement in my drawing. I'm aware of proportions in a way that I think is going to be really helpful when I get back out into the landscape. So as I'm shading, this stump is picking up charcoal, and I'm just trying to react to the flow and the general shape of these feathers. So it's not about making sure I get every feather exactly in the right place for me at this point. I'm thinking more about the gestural nature of it. How do these feathers change as they wrap around the form? The wing feathers are different from the feathers on the neck. They reflect light differently. They lay on top of one another differently. They have different edges, and I'm just trying to really just react to that more than anything. And I see there's more contrast that's going to be needed up here and under here. But before I start to erase out any of the highlights, I want to get the darks put in there, and then I can see if I need to lighten up any other areas. Patty is asking if I've used the Caran d'Ache Technalo RGB graphite bars. Oh, the water-soluble graphite. I have not, but I have seen some amazing work done with those things. That is a really good suggestion. I am excited I would be really excited to try out some of those water-soluble graphites. I've seen people make some wonderful kind of wash kind of backgrounds, and then you pull in the detail on top of that to create some amazing contrast. And so that's a really good kind of suggestion there. I might order myself some. So as I'm working through, I want to be mindful too of the edge work. If you follow along in the reference photo, if you follow along that edge, there's constant change in terms of the relationship between the bird and the background. It's either a change in the sharpness of the edge, the value relationships, just the angle of the lines, things like that is constantly changing. And so having a drawing match that level of variation is going to be really helpful. All right, so now I'm going to come back in here. I'm starting to build up the form. This is kind of blocking in the form, and I can see some of this nice variation on these feathers. And one of the things that's going to be really critical in terms of creating that cylindrical nature of the neck is to see how these shapes change as they wrap around. You can see they become a bit more open in the front, gradually becoming thinner and thinner lines as we wrap around the edge. And so I want my marks to reflect that as well. And I'm just utilizing the side of the pencil, and I'm making these kind of V-like marks. And I'm kind of reacting to the general pattern. So again, thinking back, I'm moving my eyes back and forth. And as I move up around to the edge of the neck, they become less V's and more kind of lines. And if they're off a little bit, this isn't necessarily a photographic drawing that I'm creating. and to be honest, when I get that thinking, if I think about having to make each one of these marks exactly like I'm seeing in the photograph, I just get claustrophobic, and I actively kind of resist that. So I'm trying to avoid that, trying to suggest the detail more than anything. But that's something that I notice in myself, and you want to evaluate for yourself what that tolerance is. You may really enjoy that level of detail, and so if you do, you want to embrace that fully. And trust that instinct. I just, again, know for myself that I prefer to suggest detail as much as possible. To me, it's also really kind of exciting. Sometimes you make it almost feels like an accident. You're like, oh my gosh, that accidental mark looks exactly like the feather. That's an exciting element in that. So again, I'm trying to hold that in my mind, that the general shapes, and allow my pencil to try to mimic that as much as possible without fully rendering. And now I can use my kneaded eraser to pull out some of these highlights. Again, kind of thinking the same thing, just reacting to now, instead of the shape of the dark areas, reacting to the shape of the light. And seeing how the feathers get a little bit tighter up near in the top here, so I can tighten up some of my marks there. So hopefully that makes sense. A kneaded eraser is wonderful because you can shape it into these irregular forms. The thing about nature, in terms of animals, landscapes, etc., is that it's all about irregular forms. We have a tendency in our brains to make things more regular. So there could very easily be a tendency to make perfectly spaced, even V-shaped marks as we go down the neck. That's kind of a human tendency, but it's not something that we see in nature a whole lot, that regularity. So it's just something to be kind of mindful of. So again, utilizing the side of my pencil, kind of react to these forms, and I can see how the feathers change in this part along the breast there. And there are very few dark lines in here, so I want to make sure that I don't overstate some of these feathers. And in fact, what I might do is just use my kneaded eraser to pull out some feather-like form. So I'm just kind of shaping this down into this kind of smallish point. And I'm going to try to suggest the feathers along in here, thinking about the flow of these feathers. One of the things that you can kind of think about and be aware of is your own rhythm of mark making. I know for me, I have a certain kind of rhythm to how I make these marks. I'll make a sequence of like 3 little dashes, and then I'll move on to another part. And not that there's any kind of right or wrong way to be thinking about that, but it's kind of an interesting thing to try to be aware of, is what are your natural rhythms there. So right in here, I'm going to kind of darken in some of these areas, trying to move my marks all around because it's not a flat and smooth value. There's some variation in those feathers. Utilizing the side of my pencil helps prevent me from making kind of distinct lines. But I'm going to get back in here and add some of those shadows a little bit later. Yeah, Prani, you're asking a really good question about why we see circles and squares or regular shapes when the first shapes we ever saw as humans first shapes humans ever saw were in nature. Yeah, it's interesting why we do that. I don't know. Understanding how we interpret information visually is really kind of interesting. So as I'm following along the back, I want to be really mindful not to make a consistent line across there. I'm looking for these darker spots first, and you can kind of see that we have these darker forms that become more visible, and as we transition into here, we don't quite have that contrast, so I can let my drawing reflect that. And again, as we wrap around, any shapes just get kind of squished as we move across the flat plane on the back of the bird. And then as we follow up along here, again, there's kind of constant variation. Kind of smooth that out a little bit. It gets a little bit more visible here, utilizing the side of my pencil. Now here's where I can start to look for, what I'm going to try to do is see the shape of the shadows as each of these feathers lay on top of one another. I'm going to look at the general angle. Okay, so I'm, oh, battery's dead. All right, excuse me for a second. I gotta see why this battery has died. I have this plugged in. All right, I apologize everybody. I don't know what's going on with my battery here because it is plugged in. All right. Wine break, yes. All right, just give me a few minutes here. I'm going to pause the stream. I will be right back. So, all right, let's see. Is that working now? I think it's working now. I don't know what's going on with my camera. For some reason, I have it plugged in, but it was running off the battery instead of the power source. So hopefully everybody's stuck around here. We're going to keep working on, and if we run into any additional technical challenges, I'll let you know. I don't really know what I did, but it seems to be working now. So all right, so we're back into it. Again, I'm just kind of suggesting the basic angles of these feathers, and I want to look for the alternating sequence of light and dark as we follow along here. I want to be really careful not to over-define these feathers, because if you squint your eyes, excuse me, it just becomes this really kind of solid form. And there's going to be kind of a tendency to kind of overstate them and to really render each of these feathers kind of more explicitly than perhaps is truthful there. So I'm just trying to suggest some of these feathers to kind of work through the basic proportions, and I'm just utilizing the side of the pencil here. Is it still is it out of focus? It looks like everything should be in focus. I can see it. On the screen here, it seems to be in super sharp focus. I wonder if it's the I wonder if it's a playback. The connection seems to be strong. Huh. All right, let me play around with this a little bit. There. All right, let's see if it clears up for everybody. It is a little fuzzy because I haven't really added much detail, but I see it fine here. So all right. We wasted a little bit of time there, but so hopefully you can all stick around. And so I'm just utilizing the side of my pencil, kind of blocking in these forms here. And one of the things I notice is that these feathers really get kind of soft up around the edges. This one is a little kind of a unique shape here. And I'm not thinking too much about any of the details at this point. But there is kind of a scaling effect in the sense that we get this alternating band of dark and light where the light comes in. And I'm going to use my shading stump to now suggest the texture. So I'm looking at the grain of the feathers here and trying to replicate that. It's kind of interesting that we've had technical issues now 2 sessions in a row. We're in episode 24. I can't believe we've gotten that far, but we made it through without too many technical hiccups so far, and now we have 2 in a row. So I appreciate your patience. Doing some negative drawing, just trying to kind of clean up some of these edges. And then here we go, yeah. You can even use the eraser kind of to add some kind of expressive qualities in the background there. Yeah, poltergeist, I swear. It's one of those things. I think my computer is a little tired of being stuck at home. Oh, are you kidding me? It's doing it again. What the heck? Why is it? It seems to be switching to try to run onto battery power. All right, so let me. I just want to try something really quickly to see if I take the battery out, if it'll actually. With it plugged in, will that actually power it? No. And unfortunately, I don't have another battery I can switch to. Never had this. The battery is exhausted. Well, I am too. Let me see. I apologize for this. What we may end up having to do is put this up as a recording. So maybe that's what I'll do is I'm gonna try to get this figured out, and then I think what we'll do is I'll try to push this out as a recording for you all so we can see the rest of it. And maybe I'll start all over so you can kind of see it from the beginning, if that makes sense. So I apologize for this. And it looks like it's just going to continue to give us trouble. So I think I'm going to call it for the day. I appreciate you all sticking through this with me. Let me see if I can get this recorded today, and I'm going to try to push it out as soon as possible. But I have a feeling we're just kind of done. But we're actually really close because it doesn't take much more to get this thing done. So I appreciate it. We're going to be back on Monday. What are we working with? Oh yeah, we're going to be working with perspective. So I've got a couple buildings that we're going to be working with in that one. So next week is going to be a bit more focused on landscape. So I think hopefully we'll have this all worked out after that. I think my camera has just decided it's not going to work. So I appreciate it. Thank you so much. And in the meantime, if you haven't seen the other episodes, we have those up. So check those out. I'd love to see what you're all working on in the, if you want to share them on Artist Network, go to the Drawing Together page and you're going to find links to each of the individual show pages where you can share your work and share your experiences. So thank you so much and have a great weekend, everybody. Thank you for your patience. A lot of positive reinforcement here, so I appreciate that so much. Yeah, half a chicken is better than none. Thank you, Cynthia. I appreciate that.